All right, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Brain Injury Caregiving, Navigating Challenges and Helpful Tips. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kim Stranero and I am a Community Outreach Specialist with the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey. The Alliance is a nonprofit organization with a mission to provide education, awareness, prevention strategies, advocacy, and support for those who have been affected by brain injury. I would like to announce that we will be hosting another webinar on March 4th from 12 to 1 p.m. on navigating dating and relationships after brain injury. More details will be coming in the next few weeks, so stay tuned. And there also is more information on our website about all three of these webinars listed. Now, just a few housekeeping notes before we begin the presentation. Attendees' microphones have been muted. If you have any questions during today's webinar, please type them in the Q&A box. We will get to as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the BIANJ website. At the end of the webinar, a link for a post-webinar survey will be placed in the chat. We do value your feedback, so you're encouraged to complete that survey. You must complete the survey in order to receive a certificate of attendance. Once you complete the survey, you will automatically receive your certificate of attendance via email. So without further ado, our presenter for today's webinar is Elizabeth Van Roten. Elizabeth Van Roten joined the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey as the Director of Support Services in March of 2023. Elizabeth completed her bachelor's degree in psychology at Pace University and earned her master's degree in social work from Columbia University. She got her start in the field of neurology as a movement disorder social worker and Center of Excellence coordinator at Columbia University Irving Medical Center, Movement Disorders, where she spent 6 years assisting individuals with movement disorders, including Parkinson's disease, and their families. She also spent time as the outpatient neurology social work manager at CUIMC, overseeing a team of 5 social workers covering various other specialties in neurology, such as aging, dementia, ALS, epilepsy, etc. In her current role as director, Elizabeth oversees the supportive programs offered by BIANJ, including the CARES Free Resource Facilitation Services, Brain Injury Support Group Network, Peer Mentor Program, and Helpline. She has a particular interest in the intersection of health and mental health, health disparities, and community education. I am pleased to welcome Elizabeth Van Roten.
Thank you, Kim, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully, oh, there we go, yep. Bear with me as I do this. All right, perfect. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. My name is Elizabeth, go by Liz sometimes, and you kind of heard a little bit about me professionally. But what I wanted to share in relation to caregiving, which we'll kind of talk about today, is just my personal experience with caregiving. I think it might be helpful for everyone to know. But when I was roughly 15, my older brother, who was roughly 23 at the time, was diagnosed with a brain tumor, had underwent surgery. And that recovery was super tough for my mom, who kind of took on the caregiving role, not only as his caregiver, post-surgery, but also taking care of 2 other children as a single mother, working a full-time job. And balancing all those things, I noticed, as much as she tried to put on a brave front, were probably very challenging for her. And today we'll kind of talk about some of those challenges that I'm sure some of you experienced in your caregiving role, as well as ways to cope with those things, tips that you can use to better serve your loved one, but also yourself as a caregiver. So we'll kind of talk a little bit about what is the role of a caregiver. We'll kind of talk about some of the common challenges faced by caregivers, including, caregiving stress that can oftentimes lead to burnout if unaddressed. And we'll talk about some coping strategies and resources to address caregiving challenges. So what is a caregiver? You all, kind of have personal experience with that. Dictionary definition, right? A person who provides direct care. So it could be for a child, for an elderly person, or someone that has a disability or chronic illness. So as a caregiver, specifically in relation to brain injury, you might be tasked with a variety of responsibilities post-injury, including some of these, and of course not limited to these things, but maybe preparing for return to home, after hospitalization or rehab, learning how to care for someone with brain injury or what even is brain injury, right? So you're coming into this new world of brain injury, may not have ever been exposed to it before. So there's a huge learning curve about what is brain injury, and then also what does that look like in my loved one. You might be learning how to manage their medical care, juggling their appointments, figuring out their medication schedule. You could be providing emotional support to your loved one, but also physical support if there's some physical limitations. Helping with daily tasks. They need help with bathing. You might be meal prepping a lot more often now, helping them get dressed. There are sometimes behavioral challenges or cognitive challenges that you might be trying to navigate and figure out what to do. You're trying to advocate for your loved one, both in the kind of medical space, but also in the community space as they're accessing different resources. And then maybe you're taking on the role of managing a whole household, figuring out finances, and obviously much, much more, right? So what does juggling all of these things potentially at once look like? And so I want to show you a short film, and I want you to kind of reflect and kind of absorb it. It's a little bit heavy, so I do want to just give a disclaimer about that, but want to kind of have you think about what resonates with you as it relates to this video, and if there's anything that you notice, and we'll kind of talk a little bit as we move through the presentation.
Cold wind blowing through the walls. There's nothing in this world that's ours.
Charlie!
Dark ocean with a tiny flame.
I can't leave him alone.
Somehow we're gonna find our way.
I'm gonna have to cancel my appointment on Tuesday.
All I had was you. Ooh, ooh, ooh. All I had was you. Ooh, ooh.
Okay. So just want to take a moment and just have you think if any of that maybe resonated with you. Maybe some of it, maybe not all of it. Maybe you watching her scream out when you're feeling overwhelmed, maybe that's something that resonated with you. Taking on those daily tasks, dressing your loved one, worrying about what happens to them when you're not around, if you can leave them by themselves. There are a lot in that video, a lot of stressors that we kind of observed and reaction to those stressors. And so when we talk about some of the common challenges faced by caregivers, these are some of the things that we'll cover today. But we'll kind of get into more detail about each of these categories as we move through, but we'll talk about burnout and stress, both the emotional and physical exhaustion of caregiving, some of the cognitive and behavioral changes post-injury that can be really troublesome for caregivers. It could be difficult to manage some of those behaviors or personality changes. We'll talk a little bit about time management, which can be a huge challenge if you as a caregiver are juggling multiple responsibilities, both personal and professional, and navigating some of the medical and financial decisions, balancing some of the autonomy that your loved one maybe still wants to hold on to versus maybe some of the dependence that they have now post-injury. So when I was kind of looking more into caregiving, some of the common challenges, came across this study called The Experience of Caregivers Following a Moderate to Severe TBI Requiring ICU Admission by Kreitzer and colleagues. And it followed caregivers across a 6-month period post-injury to kind of look at what are some of the unmet needs of informal caregivers. We talk about informal caregivers as being family members, friends, acquaintances, but maybe not like a home health aide, right? So informal caregivers of people that had a moderate to severe traumatic brain injury requiring substantial care by, their family and friends. And they kind of defined three broad categories as it related to caregiving, including caregiver burden, which was, the challenges that the caregiver faced, caregiver needs, which were what is it that they actually needed to help support them in addressing these challenges, and their, quality of life, like how were they coping with some of these burdens or challenges post-injury. And so looking at this graph quickly, over time, the needs for information and support reduced, right? So immediately post-injury, caregivers wanted to know, what is the prognosis? What is brain injury? What do I need to do to make sure that my loved one can recover, in the time that they need to? And so that need for information was really high up front, but kind of diminished over time. The caregiver burden, also the challenges, increased over time. So while they were kind of in hospital or in rehab, there was a lot of support there for the caregiver from medical professionals, nurses, things like that. But as they transitioned home, a lot of the challenges or needs now all fell, on the caregiver. And so that kind of increased over time as they returned home. And then kind of the impact on the caregiver's quality of life remained somewhat the same across the 6 months, likely due to the shifting in needs, right? First of information, and then for like hands-on challenges that they were facing at home. And so when we talk more in detail about what they kind of observed in these interviews with the caregivers, immediately following the injury, we're talking 72 hours post-injury. Again, that need for information and support was the most important theme in their interviews with the caregivers. Wanting early education about injuries, needing updates frequently from care teams, and needing to learn about strategies to adapt towards returning to home. And to note, later on in the interviews, people reflected back and kind of stated that they didn't feel like they got that information in a timely manner or all the information that they needed to feel comfortable with their loved one returning home. So along that lines, in those earlier interviews, the challenge of coping for return to home was a prevalent theme of the caregiver challenges that they were facing. And so preparing for end of care transitions, as they learned, like what would they need to return home, persisted even throughout the 6 months. Like they were constantly learning about different changes going on at home and the need to adapt to figure out how could they best cope at home. And this kind of was an unmet need, right? Untapped in terms of how to address that challenge of returning to home and providing the information in a timely manner. And the need for early communication early on. And then 1 month after injury, the caregiver health-related quality of life emerged as an important theme. So caregivers started talking more about how they were doing rather than just focusing on their loved one. They started outlining some of the physical demands, some of the mental and emotional challenges they were experiencing, and some of the social impacts on their life and their personal life. And they reflected on some of, like I said, that disappointment in the transitionary period, reflecting on, leaving the ICU and going to rehab potentially where they had less, one-on-one care, more concern about are they on track for recovery in their rehab, and how can they be if they're not getting that one-on-one care. So that was a big theme when we talk about that 1 month period post-injury. 3 months after injury, the interview started revolving more around what are the challenges and burdens of the caregivers as they became newly responsible for nearly all aspects of their loved one's care. So not, again, the theme of preparing for home was constantly there, but then starting to talk about how do I manage their medical complications? If something happens at home, there's not a nurse there that you can call or a doctor to call like there is in the hospital or rehab. So how do you manage a medical complication? How can you organize all these complex follow-ups and visits to all these specialists and doctors? How do you get them places, especially if they're physically limited? So transportation became a prevalent issue. And then managing all of the activities of daily living for not only their loved one, but then also making sure that they're taking care of themselves. So that became a big theme 3 months post-injury. And they also reflected on this time on scheduling and time management challenges. So again, as their loved one comes home, they're juggling work, they're juggling maybe taking care of kids, maybe taking care of aging parents. So multiple demands and trying to figure out how can they manage their time wisely to be able to still do all of these things. And then 6 months after injury was kind of similar to the themes reflected in the 3 months interview in terms of caregiver burden and challenges being the most frequent theme in the interviews. But they also started to revolve around maybe helpful solutions like having structured support to manage caregiver burden and challenges, reflecting on maybe how a poor support structure prior to hospital discharge, so like coming up with a plan on how you would take care of your loved one prior to them being sent home. If you didn't have that in place, it proved to be a significant hardship for caregivers. And then also them not wanting to tap into those supports too much. One caregiver was quoted in the study as saying, "Nobody lives near me. It's just me and my kids," right? And then they also tried to talk a little bit more about the survivors during the 6 month interviews. Many of the emotional needs were noted at this time point. More specifically, caregivers talked about the impact of confinement, loneliness, stress, depressive symptoms, and then their loved ones' behaviors on their emotional status. Someone commented like, "I have no vacation. It's like a full-time job now, just confined to home and taking care of him. And not only that, but supervising the help that I've hired." So even for those caregivers that chose to introduce professional caregivers or help, then they felt that managing that person also became a challenge. So a lot of these challenges that, were seen and observed over the course of the 6 months are obviously prevalent, right? And shows that caregivers are not alone in the challenges they faced, since a lot of these themes reflected across individual interviews. It also shows a need of support of not only the person with the brain injury, but you as the caregiver as well. And so we'll discuss how to identify when some of these challenges pop up that were kind of described and outlined in these studies, identifying when they become too much for you to kind of juggle on your own, and what can you do to help support yourself as you care for your loved one. So when we look back at the video that I showed in the beginning, there were some evident signs, to me at least, of some caregiver stress and potentially burnout. When she's folding the laundry and she's shouting out and screaming and crying and having these outbursts, it certainly can kind of look like kind of some hopelessness, which could be a sign of burnout. And so when we talk about burnout, what leads to it is caregiver stress and unmanaged caregiver stress. And so some of the things that can cause caregiver stress, in addition to the behavior and cognitive challenges, juggling their medical care, there are other things that lead to stress, including role confusion. So as a caregiver, you might be quickly stepping into a caregiving role when you weren't expecting to do so, and that can cause some confusion. It can be difficult to separate your role as a caregiver from maybe how you related to that person beforehand, whether it's as a spouse, a friend, a child or adult child, or other close relationships. So it kind of blurs the line of, I'm a caregiver now, but am I still a spouse, and how much of me is each part of that? So unclear roles can kind of emerge as well when multiple family members are involved in managing the care. That can cause a lot of stress. What is the role in actually providing the care if there are other people involved and maybe competing ideas, right? That can cause some stress. Varied expectations can be a big one. So many caregivers believe that their involvement will have maybe a positive impact on their loved one will appreciate it and kind of do anything that their caregiver will say. But in reality, we know that that's a big challenge. So the expectations that you have stepping into the role can be different from the reality of what happens and some of the challenges that present. And it can be, obviously, caregiving can be really rewarding, but it can also be stressful, and that dichotomy can be challenging. You might struggle with a sense of loss or lack of control. You probably have heard you've seen one brain injury, then you've seen one brain injury. And those differences across people and not being able to know or predict what might happen in their recovery can be challenging because you're kind of faced with not being able to control some of the things that go on, and that can lead to frustration and just general, stress. And then we kind of just described having too many responsibilities and juggling too many obligations at once can certainly lead to some of the caregiver stress. Um, and sometimes, many caregivers will kind of see your role as caregiver as their sole responsibility, and they want to pour everything they have into that. But obviously, there's other things that require your time and attention. And so if you do that and pour everything into the caregiver role, you're likely to burn out and have a lot of stress. And then not realizing burnout is happening or stress is happening. It's kind of like a cyclical thing. You have all this stress that's leading to burnout, and then some of the signs of burnout and things that happen can contribute back to that stress. And so if it's not recognized, then you'll kind of have difficulty addressing it. And so stress can also impact mental health and physical health. I think it's just important to note that there can be depression, anxiety that you might feel as you take on some of these stressors, or potentially like turning to substances to help cope. So developing healthy coping strategies will be important to manage some of the mental stressors from caregiving, and then physical health, which I want to really emphasize because it is important to take care of yourself, make sure that you have healthy sleep schedules, that you are having a healthy appetite, because sometimes caregiving can either make you eat more, eat less, but we want to make sure that you're doing things appropriately as it relates to your appetite so you can maintain your health. There can be problem with attention and memory and fatigue, especially if you're not getting the sleep that you need. And so it's important to kind of recognize those things. And I always mention, like, if you have that crick in your neck that never seems to go away, that just won't quit, that's probably related to some stress that's going on. And then signs of burnout, right? So when all these stressors become too much, and not only that, but you're not doing anything to kind of refill your bucket or your tank, so to speak, then burnout can occur. And so some signs to watch out for, if you notice that you're feeling more hopeless, your perspective is becoming more negative, maybe you started out really positive in the outlook of your loved one's recovery, and now you're kind of feeling like a dark cloud is following you. That can be a sign of burnout. If you're losing patience more easily, if you're becoming irritable, you're having a lot of anger outbursts or frustrations, then that can certainly be a sign of burnout, especially as it relates to like when you're providing the care. If your loved one's doing something and you're realizing you're becoming really short with them, then that could certainly be a sign. Anxiety or fear. So if maybe you're starting to fear, like, I'm doing things wrong, I'm afraid I might harm my person by doing X, Y, and Z, or by not doing that thing. That could be a sign of burnout. We kind of saw that in the video, right? When she was like, I don't want to leave him. I can't leave him alone. So that could be troublesome. And then you're kind of maybe becoming secluded, not doing a lot of the hobbies that you once were doing. That can be a sign of burnout. And that, like, you feel like you don't have anyone to ask for help, or that you shouldn't ask for help. And then guilt, right? That's a big one that I hear a lot. One thing I didn't mention is been facilitating caregiver support groups for about 7 years now. And guilt is a big theme, I feel like, in that people feel like taking time for themselves is taking away from your loved one. But in reality, I like to think that taking care of yourself can only empower you and help you as you care for your loved one. And then one thing I didn't list here, but I think it's also important to note, is the idea of ambiguous loss. And if you've not heard that term before, we think of loss as kind of, someone passes away, there's that physical loss, they're no longer there. When we think of ambiguous losses, they might not be as tangible. So it could be that, maybe your loved one's not the same as they were before. Maybe you had a future with that person that might not look the same now. Maybe you had some freedoms before you took on the role of caregiving that you can't really participate and do any longer, or might look different now. And so those are losses. And, along with loss comes the potential for grief, right? And I think going through the proper grieving process of some of these ambiguous losses can be helpful in avoiding some of the burnout. Like, processing those feelings of loss and grief can be really helpful. And early recognition is key. So if you start to see any of these things, then starting to think about applying some of the tips we'll talk about later should be should be done. And if you're past the point and noticing all of these things, maybe you're reflecting, you're like, boy, a lot of this sounds like what's going on with me. It's okay to get professional help to kind of figure out what are some of the self-care techniques that would work best for you. Um, Okay, so let's go kind of more specific into some of the other challenges that the study talked about. Behavioral and cognitive challenges is a big one. Oftentimes, caregivers say that this is more challenging than like if their person needs like physical support, like if they need to lean on you or something. The behavioral and cognitive challenges can be more stressful to manage. In the video, we kind of saw him pushing her away when trying to get dressed or bathed. He kind of set a fire on the stove due to maybe some forgetfulness. And so those are some things that, were obviously challenging for her. And so I think the first thing to do as it relates to some of the behavioral and cognitive challenges is to connect the two in terms of behavioral and cognitive issues and the brain injury. It can be that, as you start to get some of those signs of burnout, you start to blame the person for some of their actions or things that they're doing, but shifting to an understanding that the brain injury has caused this and the person can't necessarily control what they're doing might help to ease some of the frustrations around that. But, I think that might be one of the first steps. If you feel like you're constantly blaming your person for some of the things that are going on, then it might be helpful to remind yourself that they're interconnected, the brain injury and the behavioral challenges, and that, your person's not purposefully doing these things to annoy you or frustrate you. So some of the possible behavioral changes that you might see, and it's helpful to know, right? Like we're talking about connecting brain injury and behavior. If you don't know, then you don't know. So we can discuss a little bit of what are some of the potential changes you might see. So there might be issues with managing emotions. They might have sudden shifts in their mood from extremely happy to extremely angry, and those shifts can be extreme. They might inappropriately respond to behavior, raise their voice inappropriately, cry or laugh at situations. They might have some restlessness with fidgeting, pacing, swaying, those sorts of things. Sometimes some issues with social behavior and how to appropriately communicate in a social environment. So maybe avoidant in conversations or interrupting others. They might have trouble picking up on social cues. They might be saying things that are inappropriate to say to strangers or people you don't know well or anyone in general. They might be refusing to do things. They might get easily agitated or feel unmotivated to engage in an activity. Even if they know that it's a benefit to them, not like due to fatigue or laziness. And they might have difficulty starting tasks or conversations, even if they want to do that. And so why do these things happen, right? Because brain injury can prove to, have some cognitive challenges along with it. And so that can lead to some frustration on your loved ones. And so maybe that's why they're avoiding conversations, because maybe they're having trouble understanding or communicating what they want to say. So that's becoming really frustrating for them. They might avoid situations because they're embarrassed to have some of these challenges within a conversation with someone else. Brain injury can impact someone's impulse control. So if they don't have good impulse control, they might have lost that filter, and that's why they're saying things inappropriately because they don't really think before they say something. And they might have a lack of awareness of their limitations or their injury, and that can be strictly because of the brain injury, not allowing them to have insight into what they can and can't do. So when we talk about some of these changes and challenges, one way to kind of manage these changes can be the ABC framework. So it helps figure out when and why behavior occurs, which can be helpful with addressing that behavior. So the A standing for antecedent, what happens before the behavior happens? Is there a trigger that might not be clear? There might be patterns to a certain trigger and response, like who's present, where does it happen if it's a specific place? What's the environment like? Is the specific time of day? Is there a pain present or certain noise? So that's kind of the trigger, right? And then we see the behavior, which is typically the described as the problem behavior. Like what does it look like? How long does the behavior last? How intense is the behavior? And then we think of the consequences, like what happens right after the behavior occurs. So how did people around react? Did your loved one get something out of doing the behavior? For example, maybe they wanted attention, they just didn't know how to ask for it, and so they're doing something inappropriate or problematic to get that attention, or was something avoided because of the behavior? So it's important to kind of focus on identifying and changing the antecedent to prevent behaviors if possible. And that could be sometimes clear as to what the trigger is, or it might take time to understand or identify what is triggering the behavior. And then kind of creating a list of triggers and trying to avoid them when possible, or at least if you can't avoid them altogether, decreasing the impact. So like reducing how long they're exposed to that trigger, if you cannot avoid it. You can also focus on changing the consequences, right? So, for example, let's say your loved one doesn't want to do physical therapy. Like that's the trigger antecedent, and the behavior is they're refusing to go, they're getting verbally abusive. And then the consequence really of that is then like maybe you give up and they don't go to therapy. So you could either, it's hard, right? Because you want them to go to physical therapy. So maybe you're looking at changing the consequences. So maybe if they go, you can tell them you get a reward of some sort, like something that they really want to do or really want to eat, some special food. They get a reward if they do this physical therapy. Or if that's kind of out of the question, choosing a different activity that's still fun and maybe therapeutic. So holds their interest, but can still be therapeutic in a way. And maybe the physical therapist can give ideas as to what that might look like. As you kind of work through what are the behaviors you want to change and setting goals for those things, you want to be realistic in your goal setting. It might not be possible to get the behavior to stop completely, right? But it might be possible to reduce the number of times that it happens. And I would encourage small changes across time. So, like for the example of the physical therapy thing, maybe your loved one's willing to go like once every 2 weeks or something like that. And maybe the physical therapy's office is amenable to doing that. So instead of saying you have to go 3 times a week, starting small and increasing it from there. I'd say to start focusing on easy to recognize or frequent behaviors, and then moving on from there. Again, some of the behaviors that aren't clear as to why they're triggered might take time to kind of investigate and figure out if there's a trigger, what that is. So focusing on the easy to recognize behaviors and triggers. And if possible, including your loved one in the plan on how to address some of the behavioral changes. So again, if they have that insight and awareness, because I have met some people with brain injury that might say something inappropriate, and then upon reflecting, they're like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. So there's some insight there, right? But maybe that filter's not there. And so maybe you could agree with your loved one, hey, if you say something like that, is it okay if I tap you, if I raise my hand? We can kind of agree on some sort of cue to let them know maybe they've crossed that line of appropriateness in terms of behavior. And then again, I think acknowledging when they're exhibiting positive behaviors is super important. It can be easy to focus on all the bad things, but if they're doing something well, if they've gone to the physical therapy, acknowledging that, like, hey, that was a big feat. I'm so happy you did that. And it's important to them, I think, as well, rather than constantly hearing, if there's something bad that's happening that they're doing. For your own sanity, I think it's important to note. Try to not engage in arguments. It can just lead to further frustration on both ends. If you need to step away, like if it's safe to do so, if your loved one's safe to be alone for like a minute or two, you can clearly end conversations saying, I need to go do something else in the other room right now. We can definitely talk more about this later. And then in terms of that, calling attention to some of the behaviors in public, making sure that you're not doing so obviously in front of others. It can lead to embarrassment for your loved one, and maybe that can promote some of the agitation or frustration. And then just being mindful of your own actions and reactions. We can't always control someone else's behavior. I wouldn't say always. We can't control someone else's behavior. But hopefully the behavior, it tends to get better across the time as the person recovers. So we just have to learn what we can't control in terms of other people's behaviors, but that we can maybe control how we react. And maybe you can start to model some of the desired behaviors for your loved one and being consistent in that. And I think utilizing professional support when necessary could be helpful for not only you to figure out how to cope with these things, but if there are some things that can be addressed by some medical professionals as it relates to behavior, I think it's important to talk it through with their medical team. Time management and scheduling was mentioned in the, in the video, or in the study, sorry, but we also saw in the video, like her talking about, I'm going to have to cancel my appointment on Tuesday. She had the calendar and sticky notes everywhere. And so that is clearly a challenge for caregivers, especially when they have other responsibilities to attend to. And so some just generally helpful tips or things to think about as you kind of manage you and your loved ones' schedules is to make sure that you're prioritizing, that you're focusing on essential tasks, thinking about what is time sensitive, what's personally important to you, um, delegating when possible. It's not that, everyone has such large support networks and large amounts of family and friends that are helpful, but some might, and asking for help from others is okay. Start to identify maybe some people in the community or in your family that might be able to help, even with like the smallest of tasks. And people I've heard caregivers say, people are more willing to help than we think, but they might not know how to offer that help. And so asking for help is important because they might not know in what ways they can be helpful, just know that they want to be helpful. And so identifying some of the small tasks that could take something off your plate for them to help with can be good for your stress and your own time management. And then I think setting a routine is super helpful. If it's on at least for me, I know if it's on my calendar, I won't forget to do it, and it's more likely that I will do it. And if it's routine, then it becomes kind of second nature. I think when we talk about self-care, which we'll get into a little bit, making sure you're scheduling time for self-care. Otherwise, it's probably not going to get done if we're being honest with all the demands you have going on. And then also setting a routine for your loved one. That might also help with some of the behavioral issues. There's a lot of change going on. It can be confusing and disruptive. So if possible, setting a routine and sticking by it can be helpful for not only you, but also your loved one. And you know that they have a set time that they're going to be engaging in an activity, then you can maybe use that time for self-care or something for you. Technology is big now. So like if you are able to use apps to stay organized. One of the big things for me, especially if you're taking over a lot of household responsibilities and bill paying and things like that, organizing all the different passwords and things that belong to my water bill, my gas bill, electric, all of these things. There are apps that are like password keepers or even keeping a journal somewhere safe, locked up that has all the passwords in it so that you're not kind of stressing and resetting passwords over and over again. So small things like that can help ease some stress. Having reminders. And the big one is learning when to say no and saying no when necessary, which can be really difficult if you are sort of that helping personality. But I think, you don't have to necessarily say yes to everything, especially if your plate is full, and not, not feeling like you have to give an excuse if you say no. It could just be no, period, right? And then I think making time for personal fulfillment is important here as we talk about time management and self-care. Setting aside time, even if it's a minute to do so, can be helpful. One of the, I think, other things that people struggle with or caregivers struggle with in terms of caring for their loved one is navigating some of the big medical and financial decisions that come along with the brain injury. I think for the medical needs and advocating for care, it's important to have open communication with providers, should questions that you have arise about treatment or prognosis, so that you can make informed decisions on how to best help your loved one. It can provide good insight into what's going on. You can actually, provide good insight to their providers as to what's going on at home. Your loved one might not always be accurate in terms of the information they're providing to their providers, and thus it could be difficult for the provider to accurately, prescribe a good treatment plan that's going to work for them. So I think I encourage all my caregivers to speak with the doctors or providers to provide insight as to what's going on at home, what challenges they observe. You're with your loved one 24/7. The doctor's seeing them for half an hour, maybe an hour at a time, a snapshot, if you will, of what's been going on in between the months of since the last visit. I've had caregivers when I was in the the medical space kind of come up to me while the loved one's seeing the doctor and give me a letter or let me or fill me in if their loved one gets a little bit agitated, if they speak up a lot during the visit. So finding kind of creative ways to provide that feedback to their provider, whether it's them ahead of time or pulling them aside at some point to provide that vital feedback of what you're observing at home. Um, and then managing financial resources and planning ahead is a big one, especially if your loved one was previously contributing to household finances, if they can no longer work because of their brain injury. What does that look like for you? You might be having to navigate benefits for your loved one, whether it's Social Security disability income or workman's comp, like they can no longer do those things. And so you're having to take on those things. There's some programs out there as well for like copay assistance, like a PAD program. If you're having trouble kind of affording the bills now that maybe you're down one income, there are utility assistance programs, phone programs. So navigating all of these different benefits and social services might fall to you. And I have a long resource page ahead in the next few slides that might be helpful in terms of navigating some of these benefits. You might also look into family medical leave, job protected leave to care for your loved one, especially if they're closer to injury. That can be helpful, especially if you're taking a lot of days to help drive them and take them places. It's good to look into that. And then just outlining your expenses, I think, is a good thing to do right away. Figuring out what's coming into our household, what's going out, and where might I be able to apply for some benefits to offset some of the financial strain that's happening now. And keeping in mind that some of the processes like Social Security disability can be lengthy. So coming up with kind of what is the long-term plan here when we don't have that income coming in. And then legal considerations. So I think in general, everyone should probably have outlined a living will or identify a healthcare proxy power of attorney because you never know what's going to happen. But these are things that can give you as the caregiver authority to maybe make some decisions or know what your loved one wants or needs as it relates to healthcare. Because this leads me to my next point. A lot of caregivers will mention to me, I think it would be best if my loved one does X, Y, and Z, but they don't really want to do what I'm recommending. So that can be challenging, especially if they medically have capacity to make decisions on their own. They're able to decline, like maybe they don't want to go to physical therapy anymore. And it's a struggle really to get them to do that or to understand why it's best for them. And you want them to do it. It becomes an issue of capacity and autonomy, right? And so there comes a point where you have to kind of remember that the brain injury can impact their ability to have insight and awareness. And so maybe there is a questioning of their capacity to think critically and logically. But I sometimes say like people can make not the best decisions and we have to kind of as caregivers figure out how we cope with that, right? You can only so many times tell them why it's good for them, why they should do it. But it's ultimately their decision if they partake in that thing, if they have the capacity to do so. And so how can we cope with that fact, right? Our loved ones maybe not doing something that we think might be in their best interest to do so or might aid in their recovery. What can I do to make sure that I can cope with that idea of them not doing what's best potentially for them? And I think that comes with some of the self-care. I think you could try to address it as more in terms of, we talked about goal setting. So introducing new things in small ways, starting small and progressing to something larger. And you can also, when we talk about open communication with providers, trying to garner help from the medical professionals involved in terms of like the treatment and explaining why it's beneficial to them, because sometimes the person with brain injury is more willing to listen to a medical professional than their wife or husband. I found that sometimes it's helpful to hear it from the medical team if you can get them to understand that there's a struggle going on with getting them to engage in some of the treatments. So self-care. And this is kind of the big thing, right? Because if you don't do this, then you cannot care for your loved one. At least over time, it'll become too difficult to do so. So filling your emotional tank with premium fuel. And I like to say, you don't like to be driving on the highway and see your little ticker for your gas heading towards E. You want to make sure that your gas is fueled at all times so that you're not at risk of being stuck on the side of the road, right? We don't want you stuck anywhere as a caregiver. We want you to feel fueled. And so some of the things that you can do to make sure that you're caring for yourself, setting personal boundaries, and like we talked about, delegating tasks, take breaks and practice relaxation techniques is super important because it can ease some of that stress that we talked about earlier. Um, Mindfulness practices can be helpful. Those are things like deep breathing, taking a walk outside and observing nature for 5 minutes. It doesn't have to be mindfulness, right? That doesn't work for everyone. It could be reading a chapter of your favorite book, sitting and listening to a few songs. But it's whatever works for you. And so it might be difficult to figure out what brings you joy or peace or calm, and working with a therapist can help you to explore those things. But I think the first thing is to identify what brings you calm and joy. And even if it's just a minute or two regularly to do those things can be more helpful than doing nothing. The other big thing I think is engaging in some of the hobbies and interests if you're able to, as your loved one kind of progresses in their recovery, returning some of those interests and hobbies that you had that bring you joy, whether it's having dinner with a friend weekly, taking an exercise class, and that kind of goes along with prioritizing your physical health, right? Some of those things. I mean, I take joy in exercise. Some people don't, but doing something that can promote your physical health. And accepting help, right? It can be really hard to do that, especially if you feel like it's your loved one, you want to provide them the best care. You're the only one that can do that. There are the people that could, help out in other ways, even if it's not direct care, to give, take some things off of your plate. And the biggest, I think, is practicing self-compassion. My groups that I facilitate, I often hear people being a little bit hard on themselves. And I think it's important to remember that caregiving can be really challenging, that there obviously will be good days and bad days, and it can be hard to reflect back on the good days if those bad days seem really overwhelming. But I think it's important to manage your expectations and don't expect to have all of the information or all of the answers, but just try your best. And remember that, your loved one isn't their brain injury, right? Trying to separate those two things. It could be difficult if there's been a huge shift in their personality or who they are as a person, but they aren't their brain injury, and kind of remembering that as you move forward and practice self-compassion. And then just talking about planning for the future, which and I know we're running a little bit short on time, so I'm not going to go too deep into, but I think exploring some of the options for long-term care, if you need help in the home, if there are day programs your person can participate. Again, talking about respite, right? Those things might allow you to take some time away and step away if you have help in the home or if they're going to a day program. Things like the TBI fund, Medicaid, workers' comp, auto insurance might cover some of these care options. Not every private insurance is going to cover long-term care. And so that might be something that you might talk to legal about in terms of long-term care and Medicaid planning. You could also call BIANJ for, list of facilities or things that offer some of these long-term care options or day program options. We also have a resource app that lists those things. And the biggest thing that I want to mention is creating a contingency plan for emergencies. I don't think caregivers pause enough to think, what happens to my loved one if something happens to me? It's super important that you create a plan for emergencies, have a binder somewhere with all of the important contacts, doctor's informations, medication information, the advanced directive paperwork we talked about. And not only having that, but then letting someone know, hey, this thing exists and this is where it lives. So if something happens to me, you'll be the point person to kind of go through that information. I think it's important to always balance your personal life and caregiving responsibilities in the best way possible that you can, and then involve your loved one as much as possible and your family in decision making. Trying to, if possible, like getting them involved in the decision making process might improve their motivation to do something, right? If they're not being told, but rather coming up with some solutions on their own as well. Some practical tips. Support groups can serve as a good resource. I find some people are hesitant to join support groups because they don't want to talk in front of other people. I know our groups, you're more than welcome to come with your camera off and just sit and listen. There's oftentimes some good resources shared amongst one another in those groups, as well as just some supportive suggestions or listening that happens there. Um, Keeping organized the medical and financial records just for your own sanity, so you're not trying to look for different progress notes or bill pay and things like that. Keep everything organized. Like I said, identify stress relief and self-care techniques that work best for you. These are some apps that kind of lean more towards the mindfulness and breathing, so that you might try them and find helpful because they do have some really short ones there that you could kind of squeeze in between your caregiving responsibilities. As Kim mentioned in the beginning, we have workshops going on all the time. So education and knowledge is power. So the more you can kind of know and absorb, the better it might be for you and your loved one. And then building a support network and being creative in what that looks like. If you don't have family around, maybe you have a neighbor that's helpful, a doorman that's helpful. Maybe you go to church or other religious institution and that community is super helpful. So kind of thinking about who's around you and what spaces do you frequent with people that might be willing to help and support you. And then also, if you need it, professional support as well, like a therapist to talk through some of the challenges and to identify some tips for yourself or self-care techniques that work for you. I don't know how many pictures I have of something being refilled to do something else, but I can't emphasize it enough that you have to prioritize your well-being in order to be the best support for your loved one. And so, seeking support, using some of the practical strategies we talked about, and making time for self-care. It's important. Don't feel guilty for it. Think more of it as about, I'm taking care of myself so I can take care of my loved one. And then you're going to get these slides because it's a lot to go through, but some helpful resources I wanted to share with you as it relates to just some caregiver support and assistance in the home, some recommended reading, some legal resources. We talked about the advanced directives and long-term care planning, like exploring Medicaid for some of the long-term supports and services that your loved one might need. Benefits, some of the social service offices near you that might help with some of those financial assistance programs. And then I'm short on time, but I'm going to quickly talk about CARES, which was mentioned briefly in my bio, but it's our resource facilitation program, which can just be helpful for you if you're feeling really overwhelmed and caring for your loved one, and your loved one needs help as well. Our resource specialists can help identify resources, programs, services that can help you and your loved one. They can sit with you, go through some paperwork if you're becoming really overwhelmed with that. And we help any person that lives in New Jersey that has brain injury at any age. So see, these are some of the things we can do through regular contact with you and your loved one, can try to help support and navigate some of the resources that are out there to improve you and your loved one's quality of life. I'm going to stop there. And these are some of the resources that I used, the study, information about the ABC framework, and the short film as well. And so I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Elizabeth. That was really informative, and it looks like we do have a couple of questions. So someone said, my husband has TBI and is returning back to work. I work full time. He's been okay at home by himself, but can you suggest ways for me to be able to tell if he might need an aid?
Yeah, so I think in the sense of like what insurance might cover as it relates to home health aid services, they're looking at a need for two or more activities of daily living. So things like dressing, bathing, feeding, meal prep, maybe transfers, like if they're like transferring from bed to chair or so forth. So in the more technical sense, like if you're looking to get an aid through insurance, like Medicaid or something like that, they're looking for the need for assistance with two or more of those things. It can be challenging if there are some cognitive difficulties there because they're like supervision might not be something that the insurance is looking at, but certainly a person might need if there's like a safety concern. So I think looking at physical limitations, if there's need for like maybe he's a fall risk, so he needs physical support, that can be challenging, right? So you might not want to leave him alone if there's not an aid. Um, or if there's some concern about wandering or some cognitive issues, like that video where the kind of fire was set, that also might be an instance in where an aid might be necessary for some supervision. But I would talk to the providers about it and kind of maybe the physical therapist about if there are any limitations in mobility that might be considered in considering an aid.
And then someone asked, where can I find more information about the CARES program?
Sure. So you can call our helpline. It's in my thing here. It'll also be in the slideshow. My contact information will be in the slide, so you could reach out to me. I oversee our CARES program, so I screen any individual that's interested in participating in CARES and then get them matched. So definitely call our helpline and ask for CARES. Our helpline specialist can give you further instruction, or you can reach out to me with my contact information in the slideshow.
And I also put the helpline in the chat
Thank
as
you.
well. And then could you provide a little bit more information about the Caregiver and Survivor Support Group Network?
Sure. So we have a support group network throughout the state. We have, well, now it's 14. We just started one in Sussex. 14 in-person / hybrid groups throughout the state in 13 different counties. A majority of them welcome both survivor and caregiver. When we talk about caregiver-specific groups, BIANJ facilitates 3 caregiver groups, one of which is a daytime group, another is an evening group, and then we have a group specifically for caregivers of those with the disorders of consciousness or like a severe traumatic brain injury of someone that's requiring more of a higher level of care. So you can join virtually one of our caregiver support groups. They all meet monthly, or one of the in-person groups along with your loved one. That information can be found on our website under our support page. They're listed by county, and then the virtual Zoom registration links are there as well.
And I'm just looking for any other questions in the chat. It doesn't look like we have any more at the moment. But I know you mentioned it briefly just in the last couple of minutes. If you could just go over the peer mentor program really quickly.
Oh, yes. I don't think I did, so that's good again. So yes, so we do have a peer mentor program. It's people with brain injury as well as caregivers who kind of had a lot of experience with brain injury, with caregiving for their loved one, who are volunteering their time to connect with individuals who are maybe newer to their brain injury or newer to caregiving. So it's a more direct, like one-on-one support that can be garnered. So that's a good opportunity for individuals that maybe are uncomfortable with a support group setting, but want to connect one-on-one with another caregiver or with another survivor. That program we have up and running. And so we're constantly recruiting both mentors and peer partners. So again, you can call our helpline or reach out to me if you're interested in our peer mentor program. There is an interest form on our website as well. So you could also reach out or inquire that way.
Perfect, great. And there is one more question that I'll ask, but just for anyone who needs to jump off, the evaluation link is in the chat, so you can access that. But last question in the chat, 2 questions, actually. So as a caregiver, is it best that they get power of attorney or guardianship?
Sure. So the power of it, oh, it disappeared. I was reading the question.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Power of attorney and guardianship. So guardianship is something that would essentially be like granted by court. Like if there's a capacity issue, power of attorney is appointed by like your loved one if they have the capacity to do so. Power of attorney, guardianship would like allow you to basically control both like the financial aspects as well the medical aspects. Power of attorney, I believe, is more so like managing finances and those things, not necessarily medical decision making. That's when you want to introduce a healthcare proxy form as well, or there's some like living wills or directives that incorporate both power of attorney and healthcare proxy. So if you're talking about like medical decision making, the power of attorney might not cover that. But yeah, the guardianship is kind of something that's appointed when the person doesn't have capacity. In the power of attorney or healthcare proxy, those other directives, the loved one is appointing those things while they still have capacity. So that if in the future they lose that capacity or they're unavailable to do that thing, for instance, like in personal experience, to be a power of attorney for like my aunt, let's say she was in the hospital, she has capacity, but she couldn't go to her bank to get the Medicaid paperwork started. So I was given power of attorney to be able to access banking and information and things like that. So she granted me that because she had capacity, but otherwise it might be that you have to file for guardianship to get power over those things.
Great. Thanks so much for that response. And then I know we're about a minute over, but I do want to ask this last question. Someone asked, what camps are there for both survivors and caregivers? I don't know if you wanted to go over the family camp, then I could just touch on track.
I'm gonna let Kim do that. So she's our camp guru. But if you want me to talk about family camp as well, I can. But if you want to do it, that's fine.
Sure. Yes, so we do have two camps that are going on this summer. We have a family camp that's taking place in June up in Northwest New Jersey. And then we have a camp for adults with brain injury, Camp Trek, that's taking place in August. Camp Trek for adults is about a week long. It's a Sunday to a Friday. The family camp is 5 days, so it's just a little bit shorter, and that's for the whole family unit. And so whether it's the parent who's affected by brain injury, the child who has a brain injury, the family unit can come to camp. But both of them are sleepaway camps. Camp Trek is just the individual, just the adult with brain injury, but we do have those two opportunities available, and that information is also available on our website. And then that's about it for the questions. So thank you so much again for that presentation today, Elizabeth. If anyone's question was not answered today, you can reach out to me via email. My email is kmyers@bianj.org, and I will try to have our presenter answer it. One final reminder to please complete the post-webinar survey in the chat. You will automatically receive a certificate of attendance via email once you complete that survey. So thank you all for attending and for all of your thoughtful questions and comments. And we do hope to see you at the March 4th webinar. And this concludes today's webinar.